Hi, everyone. We're going to give it a minute or so that folks can get settled into the call. Great. Well, we're reaching critical mass, and as folks trickle in, we'll get them up to speed. But hi, everyone. My name is Ariana Bankler-Jukes. I am the Advocacy Manager and Organizer here at SCAMP, and we are so excited to present another in our series on survivor services in permanent supportive housing. I'm joined by Amy Turk, the Executive Director of the Downtown Women's Center. And before we introduce our speaker for today, I'm going to hand it off to her to give you a little bit of background of what our coalition is and what we've been working on. So Amy?
Thanks, Ariana. The Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition envisions a world where no individual has to choose between stable housing and a life free from violence. And as the lead of Downtown Women's Center, I have the pleasure of co-leading the Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition with our partners through Rainbow Services. And since we started the coalition in 2017, we have grown to 250 organizations and over 1,000 people strong, primarily in the Los Angeles County area. Our purpose is to uplift survivor voices and to facilitate cross-sector systems change and alignment, with an emphasis on integrated and trauma-informed permanent housing pathways. If you are new to the concept or the idea of our coalition, we hope that you will check out our website and hit the Join Us button to stay in loop of our activities. When I'm done talking, I will put that link in the chat. And given our focus on permanent housing for domestic violence survivors, partnering with SCAMP was just such a logical next step in our work together. And we have now hosted a number of events to bring the housing world closer to the actual needs of domestic violence survivors. And it's just been a really important effort together. One thing that we heard when we went out and listened from permanent supportive housing providers and operators in particular was that they wanted to know more about the Violence Against Women's Act protections and policies. So I'm really excited that you'll hear from our expert today, Sarah Whitman, who Ariana will further introduce.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So yeah, our third session in the Roundtable series, as Amy had mentioned, is focusing on housing protections for survivors in PSH. And that includes VAWA as well as other federal and local guidelines that Sarah will talk more about shortly. So let me introduce our speaker for today. Sarah Whitman is the Domestic Violence System Coordinator at the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, LAHSA. And that's where she is creating systems change to support domestic violence survivors in LA. She currently oversees 8 domestic violence regional coordinators and is a member of the Domestic Violence Homeless Services Core Team and co-leads the Systems and Funding Committee. So we're so excited to have an expert on this topic come and speak with us today. A few ground rules, as you know, after the presentation, we'll be sending out the slide deck as well as a survey that we hope you can complete to help us better our programming. And this webinar is recorded, so you will also get a copy of that to rewatch. Now, if you want access to captions, go to the More button. There's 3 dots on the bottom of your screen and select the captions, and you'll be able to read while we are going along. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to start us off for today.
Thank you so much, Ariana and Amy. Let me share my screen. All right. So as Ariana said, my name is Sarah Whitman. I'm the DV System Coordinator at LAHSA, and today we'll be talking about housing protections for survivors in permanent supportive housing. Quick agenda, we'll do a very, very brief overview of domestic violence. We'll talk about California protections for survivors. We'll talk about the Violence Against Women Act and then go into emergency transfers. And I have some scenarios for you as well. All right, so the definition of domestic violence is a pattern of behavior over time where one partner is exerting control over another. A lot of it, you may have heard coercive control, but power and control are at the center of domestic violence. And it's really key to note that one person has control over another. So we never are talking about mutual abuse. That's not a thing. So it's one partner exerting that control over another. And that control can look like many different forms of abuse, including emotional, psychological, financial, spiritual, physical, sexual, and stalking. And then this is the power and control wheel. Again, these are just further types of isolation tactics and abuse tactics that an abuser may use against a victim or survivor. And you also may hear me use the terms victim and survivor interchangeably. If you're ever working with somebody who's experienced domestic violence, the best practice is to always take their cue for what they refer to themselves as. So I just wanted to put this up there so you have a little bit better of an idea of what we're talking about when it comes to domestic violence and these survivors. However, as you'll see as we move forward, there is a pretty low burden of proof for survivors in all of these scenarios that we're going to look at. So this is just a little bit of an idea about domestic violence. If anyone wants more information on DV, I'm happy to do a different presentation. But let's talk about some housing protections for survivors in California. So California, luckily, has protections that go farther than our federal protections. And California protections extend to all rental market rate housing, not just subsidized housing. So a lot of all of the protections in the Violence Against Women Act that we'll talk about a little bit later, that's just for federally subsidized housing. But the California protections apply to all rental market housing. All right, so our first one is an early lease termination. And the state law permits victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, or elder or dependent adult abuse to end their leases. And I want to note that domestic violence also includes roommates in the state of California. Victims must give 14 days written notice to the landlord, along with one of the following: a restraining order, a police report, or a signed document from a third party. And that signed document from a third party is generally a letter from a victim service provider, maybe a legal agency. It can sometimes even be a mental health professional or a doctor stating that the lease needs to end. And that is it. There is no other burden of proof on the survivor, and the landlord must comply, and survivors are allowed to leave after 14 days. And I just want to note that they can give the 14-day notice. It just means they have to continue paying for those 14 days. They can leave the premises whenever they need to. Lock changes. So if the victim lives with an abuser, so they live in the same unit, the landlord must change the locks within 24 hours of receiving a restraining order. If the landlord does not change the locks within 24 hours, the tenant may change the locks without the landlord's permission. And if a victim and perpetrator do not live in the same unit, the same rules apply, but the survivor may also use a police report to request the lock change. So again, I just want to note that if the survivor and the abuser are on the same lease, the landlord needs a little bit higher level of proof because they are technically locking the person, the abuser, out of their own apartment. So a restraining order is required. But if they do not live in the same unit, that police report should suffice. I'm going to open the chat just to see what we've got. The resident does have to request the lock change. So the resident would request the lock change, and then the landlord has to do it in 24 hours.
And
All
Sarah,
right.
don't worry, we will get to, Amy and I are collecting the questions to go over at
Perfect.
the end as well.
Thank you. All right, and then survivors have the right not to be evicted due to the violence they experience. So a landlord cannot evict a tenant based on acts of domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault, human trafficking, or elder dependent abuse committed against that tenant if the tenant has a restraining order, police report, or qualified third-party documentation, and the person named in the restraining order or police report does not reside in the same dwelling unit as the tenant. So talking about this a little bit further, if I'm the survivor and I don't live with my abuser, we're not on the same lease, and the abuser knocks down the door or causes damage to my apartment in any way, I cannot be evicted for that. And I am also not responsible for that damage. And that's because it's the same thing as if my house was robbed, let's say, and that's not my fault. That has nothing to do with me. And the lock broke. It's not on me to fix that because my house was robbed by somebody I don't know. Or if I'm being stalked and the landlord says, you have to get out because this is unsafe. That's illegal because it's my right to be able to stay in the unit as a survivor. Of course, if the person is on the lease, the abuser is on the lease, that's when it gets a little bit trickier because it does become their responsibility to take care of it. But we can get into that a little bit later. And also that's when we'd recommend bringing a legal organization in. And in fact, if you're dealing with a survivor who is using any of these, I would recommend bringing in a legal organization because it's just going to make things a lot easier. Okay, and then finally, you have the right to not be evicted for calling 911 and emergency assistance. So some areas or localities have crime-free ordinances or anti-nuisance ordinances, which can penalize people who call 911. And obviously for survivors, this is extremely difficult. One, because they may feel the need to call 911, and two, because other people may call emergency services on them. If they're hearing screaming and fighting all the time, they may have emergency services called on them. So one, landlords cannot evict because of this, and two, landlords cannot be forced by law enforcement to evict the tenant. And the local laws do not supersede the state laws. Okay, so now I am going to open the chat because we have a little poll. So please put your answers into the chat. So this is our first scenario. So Lawrence is living in market rate rental housing. His abusive ex-partner is stalking him, even though Lawrence has a restraining order against his ex. Lawrence's ex is making the other tenants and the landlord nervous. The landlord tells Lawrence that if his ex keeps stalking Lawrence, he will be evicted. Is the landlord allowed to evict Lawrence? Go ahead and put your answers in the chat. Great, I'm seeing a lot of no's, and that is correct. No, the landlord is not allowed to evict Lawrence because he's being stalked under California Code of Civil Procedure 1161.3. Lawrence has a restraining order. If Lawrence did not have a restraining order, he could get a third party to write a letter and present it to that landlord. But because Lawrence has a restraining order already, he's all good and he can tell the landlord that he cannot evict him. All right, scenario 2, poll question 1. Shelly lives with her abusive girlfriend. Most nights, Shelly's girlfriend screams at her and throws things around the apartment. Neighbors have called the police multiple times. Today, the landlord serves Shelly with an eviction notice. Is the landlord allowed to evict Shelly? Yes, no, maybe, or not sure. All right, seeing a few more mixed responses this time. So no, because I actually did extra research on this one, but because Shelly is a victim of crime, it doesn't matter if she's the tenant or not, she is protected from being evicted or penalized for calling law enforcement or having law enforcement called on her. If this is violated, if either Shelly doesn't know her rights or the landlord doesn't know, Shelly can obtain a court order requiring the landlord to cease and desist, or a court order declaring the eviction null and void. And again, this is where we really want to get legal services involved because it's so intricate and any normal person probably won't know this information unless they're super deep in it. So we really want to get folks involved that can take this to court. It's possible that the landlord could evict the girlfriend. That's totally possible, but Shelly is not allowed to be evicted. And And Elaine, I see your question. What about disturbing the right to peaceful enjoyment? Shelley cannot be discriminated against because she's a survivor and she's dealing with this. So again, the landlord could possibly evict Shelley's girlfriend and say, you can stay, but your girlfriend needs to go. But again, that causes a lot of different problems because then Shelley and her girlfriend could end up being homeless, and Shelley could end up on the street, making her abuse a little bit worse. But really the best practice is to provide Shelley with information about supportive services that she can receive. If you're the landlord, you can, when Shelley's alone, you can say, hey, I've noticed that this is going on. Please let me know if you ever need any assistance. But that's, again, a whole other safety planning webinar. All right. And then I just want to note that the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized in 2022, and we added a section about the right to report crime and emergency aid. So this portion is now in the Violence Against Women Act, and it was in response to growing concerns that the local crime-free programs and nuisance property ordinances were interfering with the right to report crime or seek emergency services. And again, Sandra, I see your question. I just want to note that there are no multiple abusers. So there is never a situation where both people are abusing the other. There are toxic relationships, right? There are people that definitely shouldn't be together. But in a situation of domestic violence, there is one person who's the abuser and one person who is the victim. And I'll get to other questions at the end. All right, now we're going to go into federal law, which is the Violence Against Women Act, and does apply to permanent supportive housing, which is a federal subsidy. All right, so first, what is VAWA? VAWA is what we call the Violence Against Women Act, because that's a really long title. So VAWA provides housing protections for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking who are applying for or living in federally assisted housing. The law applies to a survivor regardless of sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. And again, VAWA does not apply to market rate rental housing unless there's a federal subsidy, such as rapid rehousing. And I do want to note that the Violence Against Women Act does not specifically include survivors of human trafficking. However, there's an increased definition of homelessness, a broader definition that usually includes or allows the inclusion of human trafficking survivors. And oftentimes, unfortunately, a lot of human trafficking survivors have suffered these other victimizations, so we can find ways to protect human trafficking survivors as well. So again, the Violence Against Women Act, who is covered under VAWA? So it's housing protections for survivors of DV, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And despite the name of the law, VAWA's protections apply regardless of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So it's not just women. All right, so survivors' rights under VAWA. So survivors cannot be denied admission, be evicted, or have their assistance terminated because of the violence committed against them. And so this is very similar to the California civil code that we talked about as well. So just because somebody is a survivor, they cannot be denied admission or be evicted. And then all tenants or program participants must get a notice of housing rights under the Violence Against Women Act. So they need to be told what their rights are. They can request that an abuser be removed from the lease and housing unit. And survivors with a housing choice voucher, Section 8, can move with continued assistance. More rights, they can seek an emergency transfer to another unit in the same program or to another unit under another federally subsidized housing program. They have the right to stay in the unit even if there is or has been criminal activity that is directly related to the violence. And they have a right to strict confidentiality of information. And they have the right to self-certify using this HUD form. And then we will be sending out the slides, and I've linked resources for you all in each slide. So the link to each California Civil Code, And I've linked the different HUD forms that you can use. And again, we really want to keep the burden of proof very, very low for survivors. So under the Violence Against Women Act, survivors have the right to self-certify and say, I am a survivor of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or dating violence, and these are the services that I need. All right, so let's talk about some of these individual protections and rights. So first we have the notification of occupancy rights. So individuals must be provided with a copy of their rights with each denial of assistance or admission, provision of assistance or admission, and at any notification of eviction or termination of assistance. So basically this means anytime anyone is denied housing, they need to be notified of their rights so that the landlord is essentially saying, I'm not denying you because you're a survivor. Every time they are given assistance and they get this housing, they need to know their rights as a survivor within this federally subsidized housing. And if they are evicted, they need to know their rights so that the landlord can basically say, I'm not evicting you because you're a survivor. And if the landlord is breaking the law, the survivor then knows what to do after that. They know what their rights are. All right, so documenting abuse. The housing provider can accept the survivor's oral representation that they are or have been the victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So the landlord doesn't need, let me backtrack. HUD doesn't require the landlord to take anything from a survivor. So if I'm the landlord and a survivor comes to me and says, I'm a survivor of domestic violence and I need an emergency transfer, that can be enough for me. That can totally be enough, and then I can move forward with it. Or as the housing provider or the covered program, which just means that you're covered under the federal subsidy, you can request additional documentation, which can be one, that self-certification form that the survivor, maybe they're not working with anybody, they don't have a restraining order or a police report, and so they just have this self-certification, which is on HUD's website, and I have also linked it for you all. 2, law enforcement, court, or administrative agency record, which includes a police report. 3, documentation provided by a professional. So again, this can be a signed letter from a third-party agency, mostly a victim service provider or a domestic violence shelter, or statement or other evidence. So again, the landlord is providing the burden of proof, right? And anything that the survivor provides can be okay with the landlord, but this is the most that they can do, and it's only one of these. We can never require more, just a maximum of one. All right. Confidentiality. So any information submitted to a housing provider, including the fact that an individual is a survivor, shall be maintained in strict confidence. If you need to send emails about a survivor or a transfer, and again, I keep talking about transfers and we'll get to it, it needs to be in an encrypted email. Survivors should not, ideally, their information should not be kept in a comparable database. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but the Violence Against Women Act has very strict confidentiality protections for survivors. So victim service providers who serve DV survivors, stalking, sexual assault, human trafficking survivors cannot utilize a shared database to keep their information because it is very dangerous for a survivor. So similarly, once a housing authority has this information, they should keep a paper file usually, or utilize encrypted emails, and it needs to be in strict confidence. I would say best practice is to get a release of information. Usually housing authorities like HACLA and LACDA require a release of information. LASA requires a release of information for any time we're talking to survivors. So that's just best practice. And then emergency transfer plans also need to include confidentiality requirements. And all of this Most of this is including survivors of human trafficking. I see your question, Rebecca, and I'll get back to that kind of at the end. All right, here is another scenario. So Lawrence applies for a project-based voucher development and informs the project owner that he's a survivor of domestic violence. Lawrence wants to move into this housing development with his 2 children to leave their current housing situation. The next day, he hears from the owner that he cannot move into the unit because the owner is worried that his former partner will cause disturbances at the property. Is the property manager allowed to deny Lawrence housing? Yes, no, maybe, or not sure. See in the chat. Awesome. So the answer is no. Under the Violence Against Women Act, a landlord cannot discriminate against a potential tenant for being a survivor of domestic violence. What I want to say here is that most landlords, I'm assuming, would not straight out say, no, I'm not going to take you because you're a survivor of domestic violence. And this is where the work that we're doing as the coalition and in collaboration with SCAMP is so important, because survivors are denied housing for reasons varying off of this. Maybe survivors do have an eviction notice because the landlord didn't know the California housing protections, or the survivor didn't know the California housing protections, or maybe the survivor wasn't allowed to work so that they didn't have any money and then they were evicted. Or, so they have that eviction on their record. Or maybe they have really bad credit because the survivor was not allowed to work or experienced financial abuse, which 98% of survivors do experience financial abuse. So oftentimes it's not as outright as this. And that's where our work together and the work of housing navigators who are also victim survivors is so essential, because what they do is create a relationship with the landlord so that that landlord knows, okay, the people that this organization is probably bringing me are most likely survivors of some sort of victimization. Does that come with, I don't know, maybe an elevated sense of risk? Potentially, but survivors in Los Angeles, I'll say the county of Los Angeles, make up 45% of our homeless population. And a lot of that is because of all of these rights that people don't know or that are being violated. So, this is a very basic example, but we really have to be aware that our survivors are not being discriminated against. All right, I'm moving through this pretty quickly, so we have lots of time for questions. All right, so emergency transfers under the Violence Against Women Act. So emergency transfers under VAWA in 2013, VAWA needs to be reauthorized, I believe, every 7 years. Covered programs, which are the housing providers, are required to have an emergency transfer plan that allows victims to transfer to another available and safe dwelling unit to protect their safety. So if I am in a federally subsidized covered program, I no longer feel safe in my unit, I am allowed to transfer to another unit. And legally, a safe unit means a unit where the survivor feels safe. That is in the law. Emergency transfer plan. Each covered housing program, or CHP, needs to adopt their own emergency transfer plan based on HUD's model. So LAHSA, LACDA, HACLA all have their own emergency transfer plans and policies, which detail what happens both internally and externally if a survivor requests an emergency transfer. In LAHSA's case, it all comes to me. We deal with things internally and we get folks transferred. All right, so emergency transfer eligibility. So a survivor or an individual qualifies for an emergency transfer if they expressly request the transfer and either reasonably believe there is a threat of imminent harm from further violence if they remain within the same dwelling unit, or for survivors of sexual assault, if in the case of a survivor of sexual assault, the assault occurred on the premises during the 90 calendar day period preceding the date of the request for transfer. So let's go through this a little bit. First, you cannot emergency transfer someone if they do not request it. Unless somebody says, I want to move, I don't feel safe, I need an emergency transfer, anything like that, you cannot transfer them. You can always provide the option, hey, under the law, you have the right to an emergency transfer, but unfortunately, what we've seen is kind of examples of going back to our earlier slides of, organizations or providers are tired of somebody stalking the unit or a survivor's ex coming back and being there all the time, coming in and out. So they initiate the emergency transfer for them. That is illegal. We cannot treat survivors any differently than we treat other tenants. That is illegal. All right, moving on to number 2. Reasonably believes that there is a threat of imminent harm from further violence if they remain within the same dwelling unit. This is pretty broad. Again, we want to have a very, very low burden of proof. So, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the laws on stalking, but it is incredibly difficult to prove stalking or that stalking is happening. Similarly with emotional abuse or psychological abuse. How do you prove that? It's incredibly difficult, which is why domestic violence has been so tricky. So really, we're just asking the survivor if they reasonably believe that there's imminent harm, not bodily harm, not physical violence, any form of harm or violence, if they remain within the same dwelling unit. And then I have a few examples really quickly. So, let's say that that a survivor starts a new job and their boss is really kind of flirty, but they're like, okay, whatever, it's fine. And then randomly their boss starts leaving them gifts and they're like, okay, this isn't great. And then their boss keeps showing up to their apartment over and over and over. But maybe their boss knocks on their door. And the survivor is like, you know what, I'm out. I've been a victim before. I've been through this. I am out. So they were not in an intimate partner relationship. Nothing technically violent or abusive happened, but the survivor believes that there's a threat of imminent harm if they remain in the same unit. So they have the right to request a transfer. Another good example is gang violence. If somebody is in a unit and maybe they were in a gang and they left and they, are experiencing gang violence again, or they're worried about it, that's another example where they can ask for a transfer. So again, number 2 is quite broad, but that's for a good reason. The time frame for emergency transfers depends on the exact policy. I don't think that it's written into the statute. It's just like a reasonable amount of time, which obviously isn't super helpful. For LASA, we have, if somebody emails me asking for an emergency transfer, I have to respond to them within, I think 24 business hours. And then once I send that request to the matching team, they have to respond to me and try to make contact with the point of contact within 48 business hours. But it's a little different for the two main housing authorities. So unfortunately, there's not a federal time frame for emergency transfers. All right, this also is, this is all really important. I'm getting excited now. All right, so members of a household can qualify for an emergency transfer or lease bifurcation, which we'll get to, whether or not they are the head of household. So if I am the survivor and I am living with my abuser and my abuser is on the voucher, but I'm still living there, I'm on the lease, I'm hanging out there, I can still qualify for an emergency transfer. Even though I am not the head of household, I am still receiving services from the permanent supportive housing unit or program. So I can still ask for an emergency transfer. That's really important. And then if I do ask for an emergency transfer, the program can figure out what they want to do with the abuser if they want to continue their support. All right, now let's talk about a lease bifurcation. So the housing program may bifurcate a lease, split it, in order to remove or terminate assistance to an abuser who engages in criminal activity directly relating to all of the victimizations we've talked about, while allowing the victim to stay, even if the victim is not the head of household. So again, same example. This is actually, or I'll use a different example that I actually supported a client with. The client was in a housing authority, and I believe that her abuser was in jail or something like that. Let's just say he was in jail. And she said, you know, if I don't get to stay in this unit, I'm going to be homeless, and maybe I can move later, but right now I need to stay in this unit. He's in jail. I'm going to be okay for now, but right now I need to be in this unit. But she wasn't the person getting assistance. He was. So then we had to go back to the housing authority. And in this case, he had actually tried to take out a restraining order against her. So they had to go to court and do all these things. But the court decided his restraining order was BS. Her restraining order was in fact the correct restraining order. She was actually the victim and he was the abuser. And the housing authority was able to bifurcate the lease, and she was able to stay in that unit. And again, this is essential because this person would have been homeless. She would have, you know, either had to find safe parking or gone on the street. And allowing her to stay in that unit is incredibly helpful. From there, let's say that this person doesn't actually apply for, or excuse me, isn't actually eligible for permanent supportive housing. Maybe they don't have a disability. Maybe they haven't been chronically homeless. It's then the housing authority or the housing provider's job to help them find new housing. So for LASA, for example, we give survivors a whole year to get eligibility for the program or find other housing. I think with some of the housing authorities, it can be about 90 days. And, you know, Elaine, I see your question. So if it hadn't gone to court, if there hadn't been a restraining order, this specific housing authority told me that they would have just done like a mini trial on their own. That trial isn't the word that they used, but they would have had to collect information on their own, which honestly would have taken a lot longer. It would have taken, you know, much more time. But luckily they were able to get it done pretty quickly. And again, you know, I feel like when I'm saying all of these things and all of these rights, it sounds easy, or maybe it doesn't, but a lot of this takes a long time and a lot of advocacy. You know, I have people email me all the time and say, this landlord isn't letting my client end their lease, even though they're a survivor. And I'm just like, okay, call legal aid and send them this exact link and this exact language. Like what they're doing is illegal. And generally, folks aren't up to date on all of this legal evidence. So sometimes they're making up policies or procedures as they go. But that's why it's so essential that you all are learning this information, and that, you know, folks at each housing provider know this information, and that, you know, I know this information, so we can all work together to kind of protect survivors. And sometimes it may be a little bit of a fight or a push to get survivors the rights we know they deserve, but this is what they deserve. All right, we are almost there actually. There are two types of transfers, internal and external. First one, internal, is transferring within the same covered program. So an example I just heard recently is that a survivor is in a housing authority and they just don't want to stay in their own unit. I don't know why. It's possible that maybe a sexual assault happened there, or somebody knows where that unit is, but they were okay staying in another unit in that housing or in that apartment building. Maybe it had a bunch of units available, but the survivor didn't even need to transfer apartment buildings. She just wanted to transfer units. So that's the easiest type of internal transfer. You can also transfer maybe from building to building. So let's say within HACLA, you're in one unit and then you tell, HACLA, I can't stay here anymore. I'm in the Valley, but I really need to go to the South Bay. I just need to get away from here for my safety. HACLA wouldn't maybe not have units in the South Bay. No, they would. Okay. Now I'm like testing my Los Angeles geography. Anyway, they need to get away so they can transfer to another HACLA program or HACLA unit within that, within their program. Okay. External transfer is transferring to a different covered program. So I'll use LASA as an example. So maybe I am in permanent supportive housing and I am being covered by PATH, People Assisting the Homeless. And I need to transfer, but PATH doesn't have any other units. They don't have any other project-based permanent supportive housing units. So that's when they would usually come to me. And I would say, okay, let's figure this out. I'd talk to my matching team and we'd see what other program has availability. So maybe LA Family Housing has availability. So we're transferring this person from PATH, their covered program, to LA Family Housing. They still retain their project-based voucher. They still retain their permanent supportive housing status, but they're just transferring from one program to another. If a transfer is out of state, that's usually porting. That is very, very difficult to do within like LASA, but you are allowed to port a voucher, which means taking it from one housing authority to another. Again, I've never done one out of state. I've only assisted with one from here to San Diego. But again, this is another push, right? Because it's really difficult for housing authorities to port a voucher. It can be a really long process. Technically, after you've been in, if you've had your voucher for over a year, you are allowed to port your voucher, but it can still be denied. But if you're a survivor, then you can port your voucher anytime. You just have to have that proof. And again, this is when we really need to be able to support survivors, because I saw one get denied essentially because, and I want to word this correctly because I don't want to put the blame on the survivor, but what the survivor wrote like wasn't enough for the housing authority. But again, how is the survivor supposed to know that? Like, how is any normal human being supposed to know that? So that's where we really need to be supporting our survivors and saying like, okay, this is what you need to put. You need to put that you no longer feel safe in your unit and you will only feel safe here. So again, that's just that support system for them. All right, going on to our final poll question. So we're back to Lawrence in scenario 1. So Lawrence and his 2 children move into a project-based PSH unit. Unfortunately, Lawrence's ex-partner finds out where Lawrence moved and Lawrence no longer feels safe in his unit. Is Lawrence eligible for an emergency transfer? Yes, no, maybe, or not sure. Clearly, I had to make harder poll questions. The answer is yes. Lawrence is a survivor of domestic violence and feels that there is a threat of imminent harm from further violence if he remains within the same dwelling unit, and he gets to move. All right, I think this is our last poll question, and then we can do regular questions. Jordan is living in PSH with their partner. Jordan's partner is the qualifying household member for the PSH, but has grown increasingly violent. A few days ago, Jordan's partner threw a pot with boiling water at Jordan because they were late to dinner. The pot missed Jordan's face by a few inches, splattering scalding water on their arm. Is Jordan eligible for an emergency transfer? Yes, no, maybe, not sure. All right, I'm seeing a lot of yeses. Yes. Good work paying attention, everyone. That was my attempt at a tricky one. So under VAWA, Jordan is a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and a program participant or tenant because they are receiving assistance or a subsidy from a covered program, regardless of whether their name is listed on as head of household on the lease. And Jordan could also qualify for a lease bifurcation. I can't remember if I said this earlier, but the kind of tricky part about the lease bifurcation is that obviously the abuser then still knows where the victim lives, right? So if you're the victim and you're staying in the unit, you might not feel safe with that lease bifurcation because the abuser still knows where you are. But to each their own, that's not for us to decide. All right, here are a list of resources. These are some national resources, and these are Los Angeles resources. This is the national LADV hotline. If you're working with anyone who needs help with safety planning, please have them call this number. This is LASA's DV unit, DV info. We have 8 DV regional coordinators, 1 in each spa. If you need support, please reach out to them. Information for the Domestic Violence Council and for the Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition. References, I'd like to thank Larissa Kaufman for helping me with this. And here is my contact information. And again, we will get this sent out, and I will stop sharing for now.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for really a lot of engagement in the chat and in the Q&A box. So let's get to it. I wanted to ask a question that kind of combines a few of the ones that we see in the Q&A box. And it's going back to the earlier guidelines of what options do survivors have? You spoke about breaking the lease. You have 14 days, you have to give a heads up, you have to pay for that 14 days. But we know that some domestic violence abuse takes the form of like financial abuse. So what are resources are there specific funding mechanisms or subsidies for survivors in that case that can't actually pay for the rent? Mm-hmm. And then 2, when a landlord is not abiding, is there any other recourse that other than civil and legal repercussions?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with the first part. There are a few options for survivors who need housing. 1, you may need to go to a domestic violence shelter. And if you feel that, again, you need to be somewhere where the abuser cannot find you, and you need to be in a confidential location, then maybe you can go to a domestic violence shelter and then you can work on housing resources from there. That's not the option that everybody wants. So there are a few financial options for folks. The first one is called problem solving. This is not specifically for survivors. It's through LASA, and a lot of other organizations have it. And this is kind of the main financial institution, I guess, that we refer folks to, especially because our shelter space is so low. And problem solving provides people funding if they're able to prove that it helps with a housing outcome. And there are, I believe, 6 housing outcomes, and I'm not going to remember all of them, but it's, finding a unit of your own, moving in with family and friends, finding any temporary housing, essentially anything that keeps you out of the coordinated entry system. So maybe I need to pay those 14 days, but I'm going to go live with my friends and family for, 6 months after that. That's fine. They'll help me pay for that in order to break my lease. The next is domestic violence housing first, or domestic violence rapid rehousing. Those are 2 different programs. One is through LASA. Domestic violence rapid rehousing helps anyone who counts as a survivor of domestic violence and is homeless, which would technically be somebody who's fleeing their apartment and just put in their 14 days. And they can help you with finding a new unit, financial assistance, financial planning, all of that good stuff. And domestic violence housing first is very similar. It just has slightly more flexible funding, I would say. And then the second part, so I guess when I was talking about legal support, I guess my hope would be that you don't have to go to court, right? The goal is that you just call a legal aid organization that supports with survivors, and then your landlord backs down because they don't want to take it any further. But it's just kind of another level of advocacy plus that. But other than that, there's not really anything to do because it's the law. So you either have to sue them, hope that they figure out that they're wrong, or go with it.
They're such a good training, and just want to underscore the resources on the LASA webpage are really helpful for PSH providers. And, there's many landlords on this call right now, and all the things that you could do to pre-educate people, including your property management staff and your social services staff, etc. There's a few questions about the third-party verification, and I think the slide sort of listed examples of that. That maybe you could speak a little bit more to third-party verification.
Yeah, so it does depend on the, I would say that your best course of action is probably from a mental health professional or from a victim service provider to have that. And it would basically just be something on letterhead that says, I, Sarah Whitman, work at this organization and, provide evidence that this survivor is a survivor and can no longer safely live in this unit. That's pretty much it. That's all. Yeah.
So here's a question. What if the survivor doesn't have a voucher? Would management be responsible for relocating the survivor?
So I guess whoever asked that question, I'd love a little bit more clarity. Are you talking about in market rate rental housing? Is it a different kind of subsidy? Feel free to put it in the chat and then maybe we can come back to that one.
And just going back to an earlier point that you were mentioning about the CES aspect, how do you know if someone is a DV survivor in CES?
Wow, what a good question. Mostly it's just people telling you, right? People come forward and say, this is my experience. But again, in the continuum of care, 45% of our homeless individuals are survivors of domestic violence. And that is the largest subpopulation of homeless individuals. And I don't think enough people realize that. So again, it's mostly just people telling you their experience. We can't really know if somebody's a survivor. They might have a private profile in HMIS, but then you probably can't see it. So yeah, it's just self-identification.
As a PSH provider ourselves at DWC, we assume that people are coming in with that level of gender-based trauma. And I would argue that all PSH providers should assume that and prepare their staff to understand, which is a trauma-informed way of operating PSH. That said, I'm also an administrator and sympathetic to sometimes the cost of trauma, both to the individual and to an organization. There's a bunch of questions about what a landlord might be able to recoup if there's unpaid rent, transfer fees. Do you have any awareness of what perhaps a landlord could?
Yeah, so some organizations will help with arrears. Problem solving can do a little bit. I think a DV Housing First can do a little bit. But yeah, we are assuming that the landlord has the upper hand, which I know is not always the case, but there are some ways to get arrears. There are some flexible funding measures. But honestly, that part is not my specialty. My specialty is supporting the people who need to move.
how soon are eligible people able to get services? Can the program ensure seamless services? So maybe that's responding to the problem solving that program that LOS provides. Yeah, what is the turnaround looking like? And I'm curious also about the transfers, right? It's hard to find housing in general, let alone trying to do an emergency transfer.
Nothing is fast, I will say that. With problem solving through the coordinated entry system, I think that is pretty quick, mostly because they want to get people supported and stop people from falling into homelessness. You know, our shelter system is so full. So if we can help people using problem solving and prevention, which is preventing people from falling into homelessness, then we're going to do that. So that's pretty upfront. Like when you call, we're always going to have a problem solving conversation. And again, with the emergency transfers, it really depends. So sometimes I'll have somebody come in and we have a unit available right away and it's the exact size that they need in their area, and we can connect them to that. But sometimes we have to wait a little bit because they can only be in spas 1 and 7 and there aren't any units available there. In that time period where we're waiting on an emergency transfer, we can place the survivor in interim housing and it won't interrupt their transfer process. We can't force them to go to interim housing, but if they don't feel safe in their apartment, we can help them get into interim housing, either a DV shelter or CES interim housing in that meantime while we're trying to find a unit for them. And then from there, it's a similar process to moving in. They have to, you know, meet the landlord, figure out all that stuff, get ID and everything. So that part really depends on like the communication between point of contact and landlord.
Did you want to ask another question, Amy?
Yeah, I'm just trying to decide what's up in the past 2 minutes.
I mean, one thing I'll ask while you're looking for another question, Amy, which is there a fact sheet on VAWA that we can give to, that folks give to their clients?
Yes, let me put that in the chat. I'll put 2 things in the chat actually. So this first one is, is a link to LASA's domestic violence website, which has resources for providers and survivors. And this next one, this is LASA's VAWA website, but it should have general information about the Violence Against Women Act as well.
Excellent. Well, with that, I mean, there's still so many questions in the chat, but we only have limited time, and you will have Sarah's contact information. I'm sure you could follow up and she'd be welcome, able to do so with you. We wanted to say a big thank you. Thanks to Sarah. Thanks to Amy for doing these alongside with SCAMP and with the coalition, doing this alongside us. And we hope this is a really informative training for you all. And I will be sending out the slides, recordings, and any other links that are shared in this meeting. So really appreciate it. And stay tuned for a follow-up email.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.